Hello, welcome to Experts on Experts. My name is Corey Thomas. I'm Executive Chairman at Rapid7, and with me today is Sabeen Malik. And Sabeen, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Sabeen Malik, Chief Global Policy Officer at Rapid7. I've been, kind of with dealing with these issues for a very long time, but with my background, which comes from the fact that, I was a diplomat, one of the first diplomats that looked at tech policy issues and cybersecurity when we talked about international global governance, a previous lawyer who looked at privacy and governance issues. And the fact that in each of these instances, I've had the ability to sort of be at the forefront of the discussions when we think about what does governance look like at every chapter when we're introducing new technology into both systems, governance, processes, and frankly, the digital economy, I feel like I've had a front row seat.
So, look, you've been a big proponent of taking a strategic and structural look about how we think about the policy ecosystem and how to make sure policy moves with technology, but is not just reactive to it. I gotta
Right.
say, at this moment in time, it looks like AI is moving way faster than the policy standards can actually keep up. So, from
Yeah.
your perspective, what makes this such an important policy moment for the industry?
Yeah, a couple things, but I think we have to also look backward to be able to get the context of how we got to this place and what do we do moving forward. And I think the real question here is focusing on a bunch of areas that have come together in what I like to call like the perfect storm, right? We're talking about vulnerability standards, we're talking about compliance accountability, AI governance, and then the future of our industry too in terms of security operations. And each one of these plays off each other. And I think really what we're focused on in the policy world is a bunch of assumptions that were baked into US cyber policy and industry practice starting around like really the early 2000s. And they held well, but they really didn't anticipate, I think, fast enough the moment that we're in or really catch up because of some structural problems, as we'll get into as we dig into this. But I think right now there are a lot of assumptions, but I'm really going to focus on kind of five real quick. And those, I think, kind of are the foundations for which we're dealing with all of the issues that we're going to dive deep into. So one is, vulnerability discoverability should stay at human speed. The entire architecture of coordinated disclosure was designed around one model, the human researcher, right? Didn't really take into account this idea of a lot of these automated systems and the amount and the capacity, because even in this NIST Inspector General report, they talk about the fact that even with the current system as it exists, before we even talk about AI, the system is just over capacity,
Can you
even with
explain how the
this.
current system works today? You have such unique insights here. So, how does the
Yeah.
current system work today?
Yeah. So basically, look, Corey, at the end of the day, like when we think about how this worked, right? This institution and the policy systems all work around the fact that the CVE catalog was created by MITRE in 1999. And then NVD was built on top of that in 2005. And then there was a severity scoring that was done with the 90-day disclosure window and this, what we call the, KEV catalog, or the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. And then the vulnerabilities equity process all arrived in a different year, built by different teams. And each were encoded by a set of assumptions on how vulnerability disclosure worked and how fast attackers moved. But a lot of these, again, pieces of this program were not
So
built
if
with
you
one program
if you
design.
think about the standard way that vulnerabilities are created, they're discovered. What's the expectation about how fast attackers move that we've had historically that causes
Yes,
the friction? So
that's right. So
what's the expectation that it's designed around?
the fact that it would take 241 days from finding out to remediating.
And so in that system, one of the things that we've seen in Rapid7 is most people design their entire remediation platform efforts around that. And in fact, government policies. Now, I've noticed a big freak out in government circles about the AI codes, the speeds. So can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're observing from the research community about what changes this whole cycle right now?
Yeah.
And we'll talk about what governments attempted to do about it and why they're picking some of their solutions, which some of
Yeah.
them seem a little bit draconian to me, but it's I'm not in the know as deeply as you are.
Yeah, so I think a couple things, right, Corey? So again, as we talked about, right, there's this sort of set of assumptions on which this was built, which has just been broken by this moment in time, which I'll call the mythos moment. But that's not really it. It's the fact that there were really a bunch of frontier models that were around the same time coming to capabilities around the fact that they could do a lot of this work and do it faster than what anybody has thought. And so we're talking about Project Glasswing, we're talking about OpenAI's Trusted Access for Cyber, Google's Code Mender. These are responsible programs built for organizations acting in good faith. At least that was what, the folks that were building these were thinking.
I agree. Look, it was a impressive effort. We'll talk about how they worked. I had
Right.
some personal critiques at the time, but leave that
Sure.
aside for a second. Is
Yeah.
even with those efforts, which I think at the end of the day were incredibly responsible and incredibly
Hmm.
thoughtful, there were some real concerns by big banks, by government agencies, that even
Yeah.
that was insufficient. Can you talk about why there was concerns there, why there was pushback there, even with this incredibly responsible approach that those players have taken?
Yeah. So I think in some ways, everyone who's sort of looking at systems about like how government and usually the private sector respond is that this is not complete governance architecture. These companies determine who uses the technology through these programs, even though some of them are more open than others. And frankly, it's not kind of consistent in terms of who gets access right now. They're working on it, but they also don't verify who yet. They've put some markers down. There are some regulations that talk about who can get access, but it's not systemic. And then they're trying to create accountability for how it's used and generate the shared performance of the data for the broader community that needs it. But at the same time, there isn't kind of, when you think about the fact that these are frontier models by research organizations, the research part of the governance that you would normally have in this system is not matching the moment. So it means that usually we have independent verification. It means that we usually have qualified researchers evaluating these tools in real time and sort of putting that out there, even creating the standards for how you evaluate. And that just didn't happen, usually how it happens in the traditional way when we think about research labs putting out products, or at least these sort of moments where you would have that governance and then these things would be introduced into that moment.
It's so fascinating because in many ways, the way that the research labs operate is they think about it as a public good with
Yes.
the overall goal to uplift the security of the entire ecosystem.
Right.
And
Exactly.
what's incredibly interesting is that there's two forces I think that are pushing on that concept. Is one is, even though government's about the public good, is their number one priority is to make sure that their government systems are secure. And
Yeah.
so in some ways, the government wants to limit public access to provide themselves a window of exclusive access.
Yes,
And then
correct.
the second part is that the frontier model providers themselves are trying to figure out and build the most effective access programs to solve a public good. Can you just give us an update of the state of play right there? Because there was an interesting EO that came out. But where are we in, like, who can get access when, from the government's perspective, from the frontier models perspective? Like, what's the update there? And in full disclosure, Rapid7 has access to a number of the leading frontier model programs, including Glasswing and including OpenAI's trusted program. But can you give us the state of play about what's happening there?
Yeah, so I would say that each company kind of started out with their own program design about what the risk level was with what they thought that their model could do. And I would say some folks thought that, as long as you have trusted customer requirements in terms of, what the risk profile is, and that's the job of governments to deny access based on who they think they don't want in their systems, follow those, and then therefore everybody else should get access. And others were of the mind that this is so new and so, let's say, and risk paradigm that no one has seen before in terms of then thinking about who has access, what you do with that access, and the timeliness of that access, that there was some confusion in terms of thinking about who should access be determined by, is it gated or not? And so right now, with at least Project Glasswing, as of last week, there are now 150 companies and close to 15 new governments that were added to be able to then think about, again, constructing this notion around the security of not only what these models can do, but what is the security risk program that you build as a government around the fact that these capabilities, even with open source, Corey, as you know, it's only a matter of time before that window closes, before that gated community sort of stays gated, because I think a lot of the capacities for AI distillation, the fact that, others can sort of, let's say, recreate some of these capabilities, even if it's not the same exact capability, as you know, it only really takes one instance, right? And so that's the fear that's really driving a lot of this is who is going to be the taker of that one instance, and is this kind of trusted group of folks that have these capabilities, so government, offensive capabilities, the actual companies that have it, and then the research community, do they have enough real-time information to be able to then think about that instance and what do we do and how do we share that information so that we can remediate it?
Yeah, look, Rapid7 has been and when I say a leader in doing exploitability research for a long time. And I would just say the models today are a step above anything that we've seen historical, and it's impressive. That
Yeah.
said, is one of our goals is actually to make sure that our customers can execute remediation against the most exploitable things in the ecosystem. I completely understand why governments around the world are asking for they want their own private window. I personally think the fallacy a little bit is to presume that this capability over the next 6 months even will be just limited to Anthropic or OpenAI or others. It'll be a
Yeah.
pervasive capability. So my belief is that we have to have an ecosystem that really is focusing on how to get the information out there as quickly as possible to all the vendors and all the technology providers so that they can make sure that their software is upgraded, and then people have an opportunity to actually deploy the fixes in the environment. Now, at Rapid7, one of the things that we're heavily focused on is one, helping our customers understand exploitability, but the other thing is helping customers be able to adapt their environments and contain exposures and threats quickly. Because people are not going to be able to remediate in moments, but we can contain in moments. And that's a big part of the strategy. And I do think we have to update our policy infrastructure to acknowledge the new reality of the world and put in some safeguards for the way that things are going to operate today.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give you a real solid example again, kind of focusing on the fact that this report also came out, the Inspector General report, which is, there is just some basic tooling and just refresh that you would do even without the AI capability that should have happened, right? And that's not a fault of just the fact that these capabilities existed and therefore retrofit. It's these new capabilities exist. So reopen up the program to basically think about the fact that NVD's backlog is a backlog that existed prior to that, but with submitting a lot more information, as you and I have talked about, Corey, that's not going to solve for all of this new stuff and enrichment that you're going to need around the information that helps you then think about prioritizing what is that you need to do, let alone then thinking about, okay, is this truly exploitable? Is this something that, we are truly finding its severity in terms of critical infrastructure, which government cares about, specific sectors that other governments may care about versus, being a universal? How do we do that prioritization work? And what I've seen, at least with the conversations I'm in right now, is that prioritization is being, I think, hijacked with the idea of speed rather than thinking about, okay, risk versus speed. And as you know, those are two different
Yes.
things.
They're massively different things. Look, we see this every day. One of the questions I frequently get is, "Hey, Rapid7, you've seen these things, you talk to people, you have access. How do you think about what's happening in the ecosystem and what it means?" And for us, it comes down to a couple simple things, which is why I really think that we have to get a new operational mindset and infrastructure out as soon as possible. One, there's going to be a lot more vulnerabilities. We have to just learn that in the world. And one of the most important things to help organizations understand is which of those are exploitable. That's certainly a heavy part of our effort. The second thing is that if you're attacking at machine speed, you have to be able to detect and respond at machine speed. And this is something that we certainly are delivering solutions on in the market today. But it's a really, really big deal that I think everyone's grappling. I think people get the tech at machine speed. People are doing that. Every organization I talk to today, including government organizations, are struggling with the respond at machine speed because
Yeah.
all of us are horrified about giving AI complete access to our controls ecosystem. And that's one question that I get asked all the time and time again. But the last one that I would just say is probably often underappreciated is if you have to actually understand exploitability and you have to detect at machine speed and respond at machine speed, you also have to be ready for an incredibly complex and punitive compliance and operating environment. And that
Yeah.
worries people hugely And this is another intersection. So can you talk a little bit about what you're observing in the overall compliance environment that every company is having to live in, even as they actually deal with these new forces that are happening around AI driven attacks?
Yeah, I think part of what's happened is that so we went from again a world where there was compliance as like audit mindset, right? It's like you touch those controls, you have a checklist of those controls, and then the presumption is that those controls have been implemented. And I think right now what regulators are more trying to catch up with this notion is that that time frame of if we know you've done your work, your homework of your program and that it's been implemented, is that it has to happen faster, and those proof points have to happen faster. And so what you're seeing in things like everything from CMMC, which is basically the defense industrial base suppliers, cyber maturity model program, the EU frameworks including NIS2, DORA, and the now CRA, which is the Cyber Resilience Act, are all going to really focus on creating a new operational baseline for operating in this environment, which is that your, let's say, papers or the things, the receipts, as you will, in the kind of common parlance of proving that these controls are working in real time, those timelines have also shrunk. You're going to have to give a lot of that information in a much more not only thorough way, but you're going to have to show it in a much more like, hey, every so often did you do it? And that is in weeks and in days, and not just thinking about once a year, which I think is very new for a lot of things that
It,
programs that have historically thought, okay, we'll collect that information, we'll compile it all, and then we'll give you the report. The report now has to be living, which, as you know, architecturally also means from your technology stack, that's a different way of interpreting, both aligning and then thinking about how do you connect to your data that's going to prove that in a different way. And as you said, we're still in a place where people are very skittish about allowing AI access to a lot
well,
of that.
what's interesting about this is something that's now coming up with companies because they're starting to see it all the time. I
Right.
will say, and I give you huge credit. Like anyone who's in the policy circles and you're wondering what it's like to work at a technology company, where you can have influence, I will give you credit. You called out this trend over a year ago, and you demanded that we actually build a product and solution around this. You want to talk a little bit about where we are today because you catalyzed the thesis behind our cyber GRC solution at Rapid7 to tackle exactly this, which is why I love sort of like when things come together like this because it's so fascinating when you have product intersecting with demand, intersecting with the policy solutions, and it's driven by your early view and vision there.
Yeah, I would say, Corey, just to kind of go back to this again, kind of real assumption, which is we have speed, we have risk that has changed. And that risk profile includes the fact that a lot of, let's say, the technology stack that AI now needs to be built upon means that a lot of those, let's say, holes, I'll call them, or a lot of those gaps really need to be filled faster because of, again, the speed at which AI allows for those things to be exploited. To the type of architecture, the work, the underlying, kind of machine that allows you to get access to that to make those decisions, and then the controls that you put around it now, they've never really talked like in cohesion, or at least with one unified, let's say, framework that allowed for all of that to then give you a complete risk picture. And that was the thesis, and that's what you and I had even talked about, is that these frameworks are really going to start to hone in on that. And the sort of GRC solution, in a way, is really built on this notion that, first of all, collect all that information. Do you even know where it resides? Can your systems kind of put it in a way that your folks who have to then, decipher it, define it, think about your risk profile, can they even collate it, see it? Number two, after that, can they then add and look at all the frameworks for which that same information is going to give them, let's say, the auditability, the capability to put a report together and match that, right? Because some of those controls, when you look at them, they're, let's say, behind for why those were put in place are a little bit different, but they're still on the books. You still have to do it, right? But the idea that now they're overlaid and overwrapped with the risk profile that you would then, sort of give to whether it's your board, a lot of these different frameworks that I've just outlined,
Auditors, yeah.
exactly looks different. So that was kind of the thinking. And then, in terms of just having these customer road shows, talking on security days, the biggest thing that we keep hearing is that, the fact that you guys are allowing us to do this with the technological solution, because as you know, so much of this was really still done in with paper or with people trying to find a lot of those like outputs, that in and of itself, everyone's like, thank you for just, acknowledging that and then helping us think through on our technology stack, at least having something that talks to each of these systems. That doesn't mean that we may not tweak it a little bit. That doesn't mean that our sectoral, let's say, regulator might not ask us to do more things or put in more controls to be able to then say, yeah, we feel like you've done the right work, but at least you allow us to do it in real time. And that's what has really been, I
No,
think.
you've done more of the road shows than I have, but the feedback I've gotten, and again, the time happens to be good, is that people genuinely love the idea of taking all the data that we already have on their behalf and using that to actually operationally and automatically track all of their compliance regimes and keep it up to date with live data, live information, and most important, live evidence and proof that can
Yeah,
either be used for compliance or for governance or to just actually verify that the right process and system's happening. Now, look,
absolutely.
as we wrap up, Sabine, I think there's a bunch of worst case scenarios of what could happen in the world.
Yeah.
I have my core question is if you think about this new AI world and the criticality for our industry, what breaks first if we don't adapt our model, our systems, our way that we actually do this? What's the leading indicator of the bad thing that happens?
Yeah. I don't think we're going to have like a cyber incident that shuts everything down. But I think what we're going to have is a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in terms of people being able to think about what is it that their operation needs to look like, the program design needs to look like. And when you do that with a lot of businesses at the same time, you end up with a mismatch. And that's the biggest problem, Corey, as you know, when there's a lot of mismatch in terms of like thinking about what is the technology solution that you should be buying, that you should be building for in your company. And you're seeing that happen over millions of like companies and decision makers. That I think is the worst case scenario because then no one has the same language. You're not even thinking about what is it that we're trying to solve for. And then everyone is just running around being like, I think I know what we need to do. And to me, this is where the fact that even some of our basic systems that despite with the AI overlay just have not gotten the care, the love, and the attention, I think that's where we're just going to see sort of building and compounding effects of kind of the bad getting worse and getting worser. And then ultimately, think about it. Do we do, exploitability research, matching the fact that we use that in so many of our systems to then think about what people should be focused on? If that isn't even at the baseline anymore, what do we use? What do we do? So I just think some of this is highlighting it is going to compound it. And we just got to really get back to some of the basics. And if we don't, I think that's what makes it worse and makes us walk blind. And then we're going to end up being in a world of hurt. I just don't see a situation right now between offensive capabilities or defensive capabilities in a world where we already kind of know what the adversary world looks like. I think it's a question of which way did they get in? And these are some of the ways that they're going to get in because we're not sharing that information, I think,
I
in a
do.
way timely.
And the interesting part of is it is a big change, but it is solvable. We can actually rebuild our policies and our practices to deal with AI-driven exploits.
Yep.
You and I wrote an interesting paper on that, and there's good research that's
That's
actually going around that. I think operationally, there's a couple of things that I know for certain. There's a couple of things that we're working on at Rapid Seven. Is that one, we know for certain that we can deliver the ability to actually surface through all the noise and help people understand what's exploitable. And I know
right.
a lot of people are worried about that, but that's an operational technology that exists today that is manageable. Yes, it'll get better, but it's manageable. The ability to respond at machine speed. We have this fundamental belief at Rapid 7 that it is the SOC of the future is AI driven, but it's human led. And what that
Mm-hmm.
really means is that the humans are actually making sure that the governance is right on detection, but they're
Yeah,
really tuning the response ecosystem so that the response ecosystem can work smoothly and safely as quickly as possible. And that's something that you cannot delegate fully to AI.
that's right.
That's a big part of the future. And then if we do those two things well, then we can make sure we have the governance operationally in place to make sure that we're protected from the incredible regulatory world that we find ourselves in. But I'm very optimistic about the future.
So, Corey, I get to ask you a question, and I know that you've been in this industry for a long time, and I, hear so much of the discussion about what does AI frontier models really mean in terms of this moment? What does responsible progress look like? What do resilient systems look like for cyber? And there's a statistic that I thought just blew my mind in terms of when we think about where we're going as an industry and where we are. And that was Stanford Scibench benchmark recorded that AI agents in terms of cybersecurity tasks were able to sort of do their tasks with precision from 15% to 93% in a single year. And that just blew my mind. And maybe I'm, somebody that looks at numbers like this and I know I shouldn't be surprised. But you've been in this industry for so long. You look at the capabilities, but then also thinking about, again, the forward looking piece of this. What is your sort of sense, predictions, and how do you think fundamentally as an industry, what does responsible progress look like for us moving forward?
Yeah. So look, I think at the end of the day, responsible progress, if you think about what outcomes you want to have, is
Mm-hmm.
that we need to be creating an ecosystem that's easier to secure than it is for the vendors to attack. And that's a hard one because,
Mm-hmm.
so much of the rewards of technology go to those that innovate the fastest, regardless of the state of security. But if you ask the question about what responsible innovation looks like, is that it goes back to some of the old principles. Like, how do we actually enable secure by default in the existing systems that we actually do? And how do we minimize the attack surface area? Now, there's a couple things that every stakeholder in the industry has to actually provide. One, first and foremost, in the rapid pace of innovation that we're going through, where we're all using coding agents to code faster, coding should be markedly more secure. Like, this should be the first cycle that new products should start off being born more secure than past products. If we get that wrong, then that's just a failure of leadership in the industry, and that's something that both technology providers, innovators, and the frontier models have to make sure and they partner on because we're all in this ecosystem together. When it comes to the frontier providers and models, there could be a tendency to try to outcompete Mythos and to try to really develop the front end of testing. I'm a big believer in security research and security testing. Overall, the thing that we have to look at as we actually release those is not how do we constrain that research and their availability, but when that research is out there, how do we actually make sure we have the right data, the right information, so that the ecosystem can actually adapt to new information and secure it as fast as possible. So that means is that when there's new techniques and methods out there, is we have to publish the research. We have to publish the data about how to do it. We have to get it to the right vendors quickly. But at the end of the day, the spirit has to be, we want to make sure that we narrow the gap that the bad guys have for actually being able to do harm in the environment. And that requires an intentional effort. And the government plays a huge role as a huge stakeholder. The last leg of the stool, if the first leg of the stool is what's the responsibility of software builders? If the second leg of the stool is what's the responsibility of the frontier models that are actually doing some of the leading research on some of these exploitation models, then the last leg of the stool is the security industry. And the security industry, which we're part of, has to take out the friction. It has to become much more seamless to actually not just understand vulnerabilities, but actually figure out what's exploitable, be able to contain those exploit exposures within moments. When there's compromises that are in place, be able to lock down those compromises in moments at machine speed, not just detect them, but lock them down and adapt the environment to respond to them. That is going to be a massive innovation work. I'm excited by it. At Rapid7, we're clearly invested into it. But those are the three legs of the school that come together across the developers of technology, the government, and the frontier model providers, and the cybersecurity providers. If we do that, then we'll have a much more safe, secure, trusted infrastructure moving forward.
Thanks, Corey. That's very hopeful. I'm very hopeful as well.
And Sabine, thank you so much for joining Experts on Experts today. And I want to thank
Yeah.
everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much, Corey. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.